Now, then I move into in the second section, move into talking about the beginning of 1989. Okay, so this 1989 is extremely crucial, and in last class I talked about this 1989 to some extent. Let me just write something on the board, otherwise it will remain unused and you might get bored very soon. um, okay, so let me write it. 1989. You can all see the board, no? You have to say yes or
Yes.
no. Yeah, because I'm looking
Yes,
at the
sir.
board. Yeah, yeah. Okay, okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So here, 1989, actually, there are four crucial papers which I discovered. This is sort of kind of my discovery, and very soon other people will also talk about it, I think. So one that we are going to look at in this course is Pollock. Okay. So this is, I think, the biggest um, paper, 1989. And second, important, very closely related to that is Chomsky's paper, which was, well, I'll tell you more about it. I talked about it in the last class. Then the third, which is sort of closer home for us, is Anoop's paper, which also was in the same volume as Chomsky, that is Mahajan. Okay, Anoop Mahajan. He was uh, he was from our department. He was maybe worked with. I don't know if he did MPhil, but MA definitely. But maybe MPhil he did with Subbarao. If he did, he must have done it with Subbarao. And the fourth paper, which I don't talk about, I think in this paper that I sent you, is by Richard Kane, who is also a linguist who is uniquely placed in this story, otherwise also in the story of syntax that I will keep on telling throughout the course. And so these people, um, from this perspective, one thing that brings them together is this four seminal, well, not all of them are equally seminal, I must admit, although I would like to propose that and think, but certainly Pollock and Chomsky and Kane are very important. Mahajan is important because he talks about Hindi Urdu, okay, and tries to show that as early as 1989, and then his recitation, 1990. So, and he was the editor of that volume. So this was working papers, uh, working papers, I think in linguistics, IEL maybe. I mean, it's not a traditional short form. Working papers in linguistics published from MIT. They still have it. These are published as volumes later on at the end of the year. And Anup was doing his PhD, and he was the editor with Itzir Laka. Laka is the name I'm talking about. Laka is the last name. She is Basque speaker. And if you're working on certain areas, and certainly in Basque syntax, you will have to refer to Itzir's work. So Itzir Laka, she is back in Basque country, and is heading something there. But Anup is, as you know, in UCLA for many years, and a senior professor now. So they were the young editors of that volume, Working Papers in Linguistics, and Chomsky had a paper in that. And that paper of Chomsky's was Economy and Derivation, Economy of Derivation and Representation. Okay, so this is a very important paper, Economy of, takes so long to write, derivation, and looks so bad, and representation. Okay, economy of derivation and representation. Okay, I will send you snapshots of the board. Actually, one of you, Jyoti Ishani, you can send, because I have sent it to our group, the last two boards. So you can send snapshots of the boards to the group in the, maybe in the Google Classroom or something, where you can. I'll create a category where you can, a category called board work, and you can just put it up there so people can remember this while revising or looking at it. So economy of derivation and representation, and here these two concepts are important, but I won't talk about them today. Okay, so if you get time, you read a little bit, but I will give a very simplistic kind of picture so that everybody understands that. So I would say this is perhaps the most important of the four. Okay, this Chomsky's paper, which was an initial version of his paper, which was to be published later, because this is a working paper, so you can publish it later. So he made minor changes and published it later, and with the same name, Economy of Derivation and Representation, is the most important because of what I discussed in the last class, which is the word economy. Derivation and representation have a history which is a very complicated and very old, again philosophical, to do with mind and language, old sort of debate. Okay, how, again, this is about how we view the world through language, derivational or representation. This is also about knowledge, so that's known, but it's kind of complicated, the debate. But here, the word economy is most important for us who are looking at this minimalism framework. And as I said, this was one of the pillars, two pillars, economy and interfaces. So economy is one of the main pillars. So that's why this Chomsky's paper is, the title of it is important. Titles of papers are always important. When you try to understand a paper, one of the first things that one should try to do is to understand why this title. Okay, so take for example, Pollock's paper, which you probably all of you will have now by now. If not, you should have it by now, either a hard copy version if you have it from before, or photocopy, or soft copy. If you don't have it, again we'll post it on the group in part of material. Okay, so Pollock's paper is, there are three things in Pollock's paper title. um, Three things are, I won't write the full English. One is verb movement. Okay, verb movement. Then UG, something you're familiar with, both of these. And then structure of the IP. Structure of the IP. These three things. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Now here in this, okay, let me write down the, now since I'm going to distribute the board work, let me write down the date as well. Okay. Okay, so these three things, verb movement, UG, and IP structure. You more or less have an idea of the IP structure, okay? Because I talked about it in the last class little bit. Today I talked about a little bit, and you must have read little bit of my paper, and you might have peeped through Pollock's paper also. So, can somebody tell us how the structure of IP is relevant for this uh, as a title here? Just in your own language, just tell me what is the importance of structure of the IP in this paper. Come on, in the actual class you'll be talking more, right? So don't be silent, and don't have to look up things. This is just informal. Yeah.
I just read through your paper.
Hmm.
So what I understood was like the existing structure of the IP.
Hmm.
There's IP going to an NPI bar and then followed by VP and an I.
Yeah.
Pollock tries to in a way divide the or split open the I
Hmm.
a node into TP
Hmm.
and agreement P,
Hmm.
and something known as mood P was also tried,
Hmm.
but you say that it's failed somehow. I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this was the thing that I read, and
Hmm.
yeah, as such, the information of like tense,
Hmm.
agreement, and which in a way one has to be there within the I. I guess that's the reason he tried to split open the I node and give more information by putting in tense,
Yeah.
TP, and your agreement P, etc.
Yeah. 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 That's correct. Actually, entirely correct. And you will see that, and many all of you actually know this, but let me just give you a brief glimpse of it anyway. So what Abhishek said is right, that uh, from very early on, even if you look at 1957, what is 1957, what happened, something relevant for our subject.
Syntactic
Yes,
structures.
syntactic structures. That's right. So you can write SS here, and please expand it as syntactic structure. So here, syntactic structure, 1957, Chomsky's first sort of announcement, his announcement that he has arrived. So these syntactic structures um, gave the world, I mean, it's a very small world, of course, gave the world at least many things, but one is the auxiliary, the structure of the auxiliary, I mean, the composition of the auxiliary. Okay, so you have very traditional NP, aux, VP as an expansion of a sentence. Okay, and the aux. Now, this aux in that period is consist of three things. Okay, so tense, uh, actually aspect, mood. Okay, aspect, you can also say agreement. Now we're going to say, although these are different things. Okay, as you know, all of you know that aspect is not agreement, agreement is something else. So since we're going to sometimes say tam, that tam traditionally in traditional linguistics is really tense, aspect, and mood. Okay, not really agreement, but for our context it is actually agreement. So we are looking at tense, agreement, and mood. We're not looking at aspect. Okay, so please don't confuse on this, get confused on this, and remember we can revise it later on, because I mentioned it because this aspect is going to come. Already it came in your syntax too. Okay, we had for passive we had something like enp. Okay, and some people wrote in that time in exams or in the class also as aspect p. So aspect is very much there, but what Pollock did, what Abhishek said, is to show, show, and how he showed is very important. So his proof. So how he showed, I'll talk about it. That's why I wrote the word show. He showed that this cannot be one category. It has to be separated. Okay, at least in these two, in this paper, in my paper, and also in Pollock's paper, you will find this conclusion that two, at least two in this out of these three can must be separated out. Okay, separated out means they have to be recognized as full maximal categories. Okay, so they have to be recognized as full maximal categories. So you cannot have to I'm not tracing the full development how ox became I, etc. You know it, we have done it. You cannot just have one I which actually carries the information of tense, agreement, and mood. But ideally, you should have a TP, you should have an AGRP, you should have an mood P. Of course, not in that linear alignment or hierarchical alignment. In fact, mood is much higher. Okay, so now, as Abhishek correctly pointed out, that I talk about mood P, which Pollock talked about, and they, again, I think, I don't know if I might have mentioned this in the, maybe in the footnote or in the paper itself. I haven't read it now. I just remember there is a little background story to that. In 1994, the first sort of summer school in syntax was organized in India, and it was very significant for many of us. So we were young, starting out scholars that time, 1994, and both myself and Aisha Kidwai from JNU were participants there, and I was about to finish my first PhD, and Aisha was in the middle of it, or maybe going to start. No, she had not started yet, something like that. So, and there were other people, and we actually have a photograph from that time. So there, Pollock was one of the teachers, and again, and that cyclo-style copies I talked about, he distributed those long full-scape papers, cyclo-style prints of printouts of cyclo-style copies of his manuscript at that time, where he actually talked about mood. So we came to know about mood or mood P much before it was published. I think it was published in some kind of obscure place, not in mainstream syntax journals. So I don't actually remember. And to tell you the truth, um, I've never seen it also. So the printed version. So that's the story of that. So we came to know about mood, and we worked, and then I sort of when I started teaching, I mean, I was teaching by that time anyway. 93, I got my first job, and I had the first student, and I talked about her in this, and she's not a linguist for many decades now, and she was doing MA there in Baroda, and there was a MA dissertation, I think, and I asked her to use this mood P, because I also use that in my work later on. And then she went on to Hyderabad, worked with the same supervisor that I had worked in Hyderabad, Prabal Das Gupta, and did an MPhil with him and used this mood phrase. So that's the story of mood. But then it sort of fell into disfavor quickly, and there are not many people who take it. It has sort of come back in some ways in late 90s, and some people who work in a more or less Kenyan tradition. Kenyan, this last name in this four papers, Kane, Richard Kane, in the Kenyan tradition. And what it is exactly, I'll tell you, maybe if not today, later on, who work on the Kenyan tradition, which spells out in detail all the projections, and they can be that they can explode to like something like 12 nodes, etc., like that in a tree. So those who work in that kind of tradition, which is actually has a, I have thought about it, it has a deeper sort of precedence in Europe. So it's kind of a Europe versus America kind of linguistics, and I won't talk about it today because I talked about many stories already. But I will talk about it, structuralism and the not so structuralist kind of view, which was prevalent at the same time in Europe. So anyway, Kane sort of, although American, represents that kind of tradition, and people who work in that kind of tradition, which is a sort of a cartographic, I will write the word on the board so that you remember. It's cartographic tradition. I write near Kane, although I'm not sure if he would be willing to be associated with cartographic. Okay, so it's like cartography is like map making, right? So cartographic is like detailed, structure of the mostly the left periphery. Okay, so if left periphery of the clause, so left periphery is really your spec positions, no? So what are the different inhabitants of the specs, that kind of thing. So you can say you'll find these two together very often. That's why I will write it down. Left, oops, very, very, okay. So there people still use mood, and it's sort of a comeback thing. And you might find it to be useful in your work when you do the term paper too. You might also find it useful. So here I want to say that that's not how it proceeded. Mood phrase sort of fell in disuse, and I'm talking about 1994. After many years after 89. So he's already reviving kind of mood there, but didn't work that way. But then tense and agreement, definitely, he claimed in this paper to have their own projection, which means you have TP, at least TP, and AGRP in the clause structure. Okay, so that's the reference to this third thing, structure of the IP. Definitely, the structure of the IP changed from what you're familiar with from L5 or your syntax 1 to what it is going to be, at least right at the beginning here in this course. And I warn you that the structure is going to change very soon in within the course duration of this paper as well. So don't get a shock at that time, as some of you may guess that we will get rid of. First, we will spend lot of energy trying to motivate this agreement phrase. Okay, TP is kind of more or less a newer diacritic or newer version of our IP. In fact, in New York, at least when I was teaching you guys, I was already putting TP in place of IP deliberately, sometime trying to uh, create that impression in your head. At least some of you who might have noticed is that they one and the same thing. So that's what you should think, that they one and the same thing. But you know the history, of course. IP actually contains AGRP, TP, MootP, all these things. But here, TP is not that old IP, but it is that nearer to the old IP when you take out everything else except I or tense from that IP. Okay, so structure is going to change, and we're going to motivate this agreement phrase very much in this Pollock paper, and Chomsky is working of that paper. But we are also going to get rid of it little later in the course, maybe after the autumn break or something. So that's what happens, and many people get shocked and say, well, what is the point? Well, again, that is exactly what we do in science. You have a hypothesis, you try to prove evidence, and then you try to find out something which goes against the hypothesis. Then you try to construct another hypothesis, and that is actually progress. Okay, not lack of progress, but it is actually progress. So that's your third part of the title, structure of IP in Pollock's paper. The first part is verb movement. Okay, now this verb movement is really about the empirical domain of the paper. What is he talking about in this paper? He is talking about verb movement. Okay, so this should remind you of. I don't have space here, so I will write it here. This should remind you of in English we saw in syntax 1 that there is movement from I to V. Okay, so this we called as lowering. I to V, lowering. Okay, so I to V, lowering. I going down to V. So this is one of the head movements. This lowering example is one of the head movements. There it goes by various name, and all of them are meaningful. So head movement, which is the generic name. So any two heads moving towards one another would be head movement. So X moving towards Y or Y moving towards X will be head movement. Then lowering, that to emphasize that it is not raising, that is relevant only if you know a little bit more than this, which you know, and today also I repeated. is the difference between English and French, but I'll come back to it. So lowering is one name, head movement is one generic name. Lowering is this specific context, but the term lowering highlights the difference between English and French for this paper. For other languages, you might think of other language pairs. It is also called in 57 affix hopping. Okay, affix hopping is nothing but another name for head movement only. Okay, affix hopping. And I think in the handout in syntax 1, I abbreviated it as AH. Okay, affix hopping. Now this hopping was used in relation to the word. This word hopping was used in relation to English, which means lowering. Okay, so it goes back to the other term lowering. So all these terms you can use, and you should be careful that affix hopping you can't use for raising. At least I think that is my impression. One has to check, but affix hopping cannot be used for, let's say, what I'm going to say next, which is in French. So in French, what you have is, let me change it back to, well, let me just change the color. Oh, I could have done the same. Okay. So here, let it be. So here, in French, what you notice is that it is not affix hopping or not lowering, but rather, in fact, it is raising. Okay. So this is French. Okay, simple examples, you will have simple examples which shows this difference, and that difference has to do with the placement of adverb. Okay, so one empirical type of evidence is from adverb in this paper. Okay, so you find this is something which is familiar, that uh, um, um, uh, you say in English, you say the example, actually I'm perhaps quoting, Mohan, rarely visited Sonia. That is probably the example I might have used in syntax 1. So you see, rarely is coming here before the verb. Verb meaning two parts, right? And I don't have to ask you this, all of you should know this. Visit and ed. And here ed is not really tense but aspect. Okay, and this is your v. Okay, so here the v and aspect together visited here, but inflection, the tense is also there, and the tense inflection moves down from this position. So I moves down from this position to this position, and therefore the adverb appears before the verb complex. Okay, whereas in French, so this is English, in French you will find that exactly opposite. So here Mohan will come here, of course, but you will have visited. So this is, I'm writing English only, visited, rarely Sonia. Okay, so this is French. So this much you know already, and this is the main, very well discussed empirical domain. Okay, so this is uh, French, English. There are many details that we will have to sort out later on. So I'm already introducing one detail, which is about main verb. Okay, French, English, main verb, movement. So this is the empirical domain, and there have been a lot of work on this. And get out of this. Yeah. So there have been a lot of work from this, in fact, from early 70s. In fact, in Pollock, in the footnote, you will see he in fact talks about 60s. But let us not go back that far. 70s, from 70s onwards, and the work that we will refer to is Emmons, Joseph Emmons' work. So Emmons, 1976. This is a book. Okay, this is a book that came out from his PhD, which was earlier. PhD. What am I writing? PhD. Okay. This is a PhD turned into a book and came out in 1976, printed in 1976. So Emmons, 1976. It's a PhD at MIT, looking at this traditional, difference between English and French. Okay, so one thing that you will have to appreciate here, I think I mentioned this in my paper also, that this is a very first step towards something like comparative syntax. Okay, so this is the very first, and Pollock says as much. This is the very first step towards comparative syntax. And Pollock's paper, I would consider as in fact a further better step towards comparative syntax. Towards comparative syntax meaning how to do comparative syntax. Okay, so here once we have done the paper, or more or less main parts of the paper, you will see that this is another way. It's a kind of a methodology. So this is a methodological point. In fact, this is a methodology of doing syntax is by comparing. So suppose my when I was doing MA, I was comparing all the time Bangla and Hindi. Okay, and I was trying to figure out differences, and all young scholars who were brought up in the GB sort of period, or as linguists, I mean, brought up in the GB environment, in that academic sort of environment, were very much impressed by this main thing of GB, of which GB is the first clear evidence, or clear empirical evidence, you could say, or clear theory, which talks about this the whole notion of principles and parameters. And the first, I think, topic I talked about in my introductory lectures in syntax 1. Hmm? So there are principles which we did throughout the course. We did all this binding theory, then theta, I will write it like this, theta theory, then control theory, all these things that we did. So this control theory, theta theory, binding theory, case theory, all these are principles. Okay, the parameters we actually didn't do much, but this one, let's say English French versus English main verb movement. This is a very weird way of writing this main verb. Please expand. Main verb movement is an empirical thing. Okay, or you could see it as your group of languages you might want to compare as just a way of learning about this. So principles and parameters, and it's not just about how you do syntax, the deeper consequences of or the deeper claims of principles and parameters. And I think that is where it began, sort of, when GB began, this was very much in the background. This whole notion of principles and parameters was very much in the background. It was not so much in the actual formalism, right? Actual formalism is what we did here. And okay, let me go back to human face, and yeah, yeah, yeah. Anisha had logged out, I think. Yeah, so she's back. So these principles and parameters, I'm not showing the board anymore. Principles and parameters is much bigger claim about the human mind and language connection, right? That these are principles which are sort of um, I won't give the full thing, but because most of you know this, it's something which is genetically wired. Okay, these principles we may not have exactly like binding theory or case theory, but there are things which you're born with. This is the innateness hypothesis, that you're born with certain ways of understanding this thing called language. I don't know what this thing is, the language, whether it's an object, whether it's a tool, but it seems to be something in, inseparable. It sort of rules everything. It's even if I don't speak, it is language which is ruling my knowledge, everything. So it's a kind of a very important thing. I can only say it's a thing. So we understand this thing in ways which is a combination of these two principles. Principles are the sort of genetically wired things that we are born with. Okay, and here it's a responsibility of neurolinguistics to do cutting edge work in the future. It has not done so far that much, because there's embroiled in some kind of controversy right from the beginning, because of the controversy that we have in linguistics itself. We have between the rationalistic and the empiricist, and mostly more relevant is the psychological lens here between behaviorism and mentalism. That is, debate about how you acquire language, that debate. So that controversy remains, and many people in neurolinguistic work or even neuroscientists are caught in this debate, and therefore the progress is slower than you would expect in any scientific discipline. So anyway, so neurolinguists will tell us in future more about exactly what we are born with, but we are certainly, there's clear evidence that we are born with certain things. And here, I usually connect the evolution story, language evolution story, with the innateness hypothesis, but that I'm not going to do here. So these are the principles that you're born with, and the parameters are the your experiential things. It's a bit like you experience this thing called language because you hear the sounds. So you are kind of born with some quote unquote language or quote unquote grammar. Grammar, by the way, doesn't mean grammar books for us or set of rules for us. Grammar means this: the knowledge of language in your head, okay, which you're born with, and you're constantly refining and coming up with a knowledge in your head. It has nothing to do with speech. As it turned out, it has something to do with speech, and that's the evolutionary accident. That is what I talk about in MPhil classes. But so speech is not language. Language is what is in your head, maybe closer to thinking, but it's different from thinking as well. So this is the stuff that we are born with, but then you encounter speech, by which you encounter or evidence of language in other people's head, your mother, your uh, caregivers, your community, your peer, your friends. So that experience, that linguistic experience, okay, changes your initial set of settings, your initial settings. You're born with certain kind of settings, so you have to sort of rewire things in your head, right? So that's exactly what parameters is. So if you're born in the English speaking community, you rewire this verb movement and say, well, it's an inflection which lowers down onto the verb. It's affix hopping. If you're born in the French community, you would say that, well, it's the verb which moves up to the inflection. Okay, it's raising, it's not affix hopping, right? So this is exactly what we're doing this quote unquote silly thing called verb movement in English and French, but it is actually talking about our human mind. And so principles and parameters became, in retrospect, much clearer a project, and in fact the main project, which turned out to be the biolinguistics element that we have in what we are doing, which is intimately connected with the story of evolution. That's what happened. So these principles and parameters in GB, and you have principles and parameters. So this is a very clear example of a parameter, a well discussed parameter from 70s. And this is also a way of doing comparative syntax. Okay, so Pollock's paper is a better example of doing comparative syntax, because by doing comparative syntax, he is bringing in a change in the clause structure, and that change in clause structure, as I'll try to show, is bringing in a whole sort of storm. The butterfly effect is bringing a whole storm in the way we think about language or way we understand language. Okay, so we start with this, that it is starting with, I'm ending the class today, it is starting with a very innocuous thing by sort of mapping the difference in verb movement, main verb movement between English and French, but it is going much beyond it. And I also talk about the kind of evidence he uses, kind of methods he uses to show or to talk about the difference between English and French main verb movement, namely historical evidence. You know, not people don't usually use this or didn't use it before, but it's a valid way of looking at syntactic parameters. Historically, what was the situation? And those who will read or have read a little bit of the Pollock paper, you will see that English did have French like verb to inflection movement, but then it gave up because of other pressures of the language, not because it was a different country at a different sea level or anything like that. No functional reason for that, but different pressures within the language, within the sentence structure, which sort of then prevented verb from moving. So that's the beauty of the paper at the beginning. If you read the first footnote, second footnote, also you'll find a detailed discussion and indication of further work that can be done on historical linguistics from this perspective, looking at the difference in clause structure in Old English and modern English. In modern English, we don't have this movement because we know that the adverb appears before the verb. Okay, so this is verb movement, part of the title. So title, we have talked about the IP structure, and that seems to be the main noise that this paper makes. Okay, when you get the paper, everyone say, oh, Pollock's paper, that changed the clause structure, didn't it? Yes, after 20 years also, some of you might remember, oh, Pollock's paper. I'm being overtly optimistic, okay, but still you might remember that there was to be Pollock's paper which changed the clause structure. Okay, so that's a single message which sort of remains with Pollock's paper. But that's one of the messages, and that's the IP structure, last part of the title. But the first part of the title reminds us of a well discussed empirical difference between English and French, which refers to parameters of syntax, of principles and parameters. And the middle part is UG. So let me just briefly talk about it and then I'll finish the class. I didn't look at the time, but it's 1:20. Briefly, I'll mention this. The middle part is UG, and he says right in the first paragraph, I think, that he derives or he reduces these differences or derives these differences from UG. Okay, so he's making a very familiar point, familiar from people who are familiar with principles and parameters theory, okay, or any theory which follows principles and parameters kind of theoretical construct. Okay, so but he establishes his very strong grounds that there is one clause structure. Clause structure is not different of English and French, but the nature of the movement inside the clause structure, that I to V or V to I or T to V and V to T, that's going to be different. Okay, and the main meat, okay, empirical theoretical meat of his paper is what is between this I and V. Okay, as Abhishek said, what is in between these two is EGR. Okay, so already you can see that this is going to be our closest friend agreement. It is coming to us as AGR. That's the first introduction of to agreement. So AGR is between T on upper and V niche. The clause structure remains the same, and that is given by UG. That is given by the principles part. But the parameters part tells you, well, because of the nature of the thing which is coming in between, namely AGR, being different in English and in French, and he calls it the opacity of agreement, opacity of a head. How clearly visible this is. Is it opaque or is it transparent? Okay, if it's opaque, then it's going to block movement from V to I or I to V. Okay, if it's going to, well, it's not going to block movement from one direction. We'll have to sort this out later on, but I won't go into technicalities today. I want you to understand the foundational reasons for doing this paper, how important this paper is. So this agreement is something which is going to play a very crucial role, and this paper is really about the nature of this agreement, and he justifies it from historical point of view, that historically this agreement can be shown to be present, and now we can represent this in our derivations, in our trees, and our clause structure is going to change. So this is the message from these three parts of the titles. Verb movement, different from English, in English and French. The difference is derived from UG, that's the second part. Okay, and as a result of this, we have a change in clause structure. What my paper does is to go beyond this. There's a fourth part, which is that it brings a kind of storm in our thinking life. Okay, so that's the putting these two things and our class in context. That is what I would end this today's class with. If you have questions, I can ask. You can post the questions. I will make a email group also. The group is now more stabilized, and I don't know if there going to be any change in the third week of September. I hope not, in the composition of this group. But I mean, this is the usual group. In last year also it was like 9, or maybe it was 11, but became 9, something like that. So, but 9 is the number which has been staying for quite some time in this. I mean, there's something to do with the number 9. I think for advanced syntax we end up getting 9. So fine. So that's we stay with that, and we start like this, and we'll get into more technicalities, and we get into heavy theorization when we look at Chomsky for some time, but then we switch to Pollock very soon, and then you will find it better and easier to grasp. Doesn't mean that you ignore the Chomsky part, because again that is something which is foundational. So I want you to understand, and understand with equal intensity, the same intensity that I am giving you. You try to reciprocate that intensity, understand it, create an atmosphere in your academic life like that. Also read about it, extra things, and bring extra evidence, talk about other languages. All of that creates your interest in the subject. Okay, so I will end here, and unless you have a question on anything I said specifically today, or anything to do with linguistics or syntax, we can talk about it. Otherwise, I will see you most probably around the same time on Tuesday.
Sir, I have a
Yeah,
question.
Madhu.
So you were talking about I to we lowering in English, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does that account for a sentence like he walked slowly, where the adverb is anyway placed after the verb?
Yes. So gets at, it's a good question. It goes into first of all, you're looking at intransitive verb. So we have to remember that structure, and it goes into the discussion. Then goes into, in fact, in a little bit of cartographic manner, in the types of adverbs that we're looking at. So I'm giving a overtly simple picture. Not so. For example, well is an adverb, but then it always comes at the end. Okay, so it depends on the type of the adverb, and there is in fact, one of the works that he mentions, Pollock mentions in the first footnote, I think, when he's talking about comparative syntax, is not just Emmons 1976, but also Jackendorf 1972, which is the book. Jackendorf, it's a very important book at that time, and later also, but like I read when I was doing my MA. So that book in 1972, he talks about broadly three kinds of adverbs. Okay, sentential adverb, then verb related adverbs, and manner adverb. or manner adverbs and something else. See, I don't remember exactly. And he showed that they syntactically they are placed at different places. Okay, there are certain adverbs which are placed lower in the spine clausal structure. Certain adverbs you have to place in adjoint to the IP or the even the CP. Something like, frankly, or damn is an adverb. You start a sentence with damn. So these kinds of things are initiated there. But I said cartographic because much later in 90s, 95, we think, Cinque, Guglielmo Cinque. I don't want to do the presentation, but I would have liked to write the name. Maybe I'll write sometime later. And I wrote it on the board in syntax 1. The spelling is Cinque. Okay, so it's Cinque, not sink. The pronunciation is Cinque. So Cinque, in 1995, he wrote a book on adverbs, and that is completely a true representative of the cartographic project, where he looked at the left periphery, in fact, the adverb placement, and he actually proposed. It sounds. I mean, I won't do a summary, so I won't tell you the number. But those who want to make fun of this, give you a number that so many places of adverbs. But actually, he showed that there's different types, and we worked on this. We worked on this. Uh, yeah, my first PhD, in fact, first and maybe third, first and second, both are on this adverb. My students' PhD, I mean. So the first PhD was Vietnamese, and I think the second PhD was yeah, it was submitted much later, but second PhD student on Maithilan, and she also Vietnamese also looked at the adverb placement in a clause, and Maithilan Manipuri also looked at it, and in a way confirmed the Cinque hierarchy, although these are very different languages. So one has to get a good answer, one has to go into that territory, starting maybe with Jackendorf 1972, and then at least looking at Cinque 1995 in classes of adverbs, and then look at one's languages, and you will find that, well, slowly is a different kind of adverb. Sometime there are adverbs which can appear at both places, like quickly. Hmm? Um, but some adverbs will have to be pre-verbal, some adverbs will have to be verb final, and verbs can be, some adverbs can be mobile between these two, and some adverbs have to be really high. That is a broad picture, but Cinque's book actually shows many placements like that. It's not just high, low, mid, but many placements. So depending on that, so and there are other ways to prove in that sentence that the inflection actually has lowered in English, but the adverb doesn't give you the same kind of. Remember also, same kind of result. So remember also that Pollock looks at not just adverbs and verb relation, but also sentential negation. That's a big thing. Sentential negation as another evidence of the same type, and then questions. Okay, questions, WH questions, and then quantifiers, floating quantifiers. So there are four kinds of empirical evidence. I wish I could write on the board. Maybe next time I'll, or remind me to write it so that we have a complete picture, or I'll write it and then take a snapshot, a screenshot, and send it to you. There are four kinds of empirical evidence. One is, and I'll write Cinque also in that board. One is your adverb, which is very nice and easy to see because you're familiar with it from your syntax one. Other is negation. We haven't done that. We'll look at that as well. Then another question, I don't know whether we look at questions in the context of this paper, English and French question, but we'll look at quantifiers briefly, and we'll see that there are other ways of showing that in English the verb does not move. Okay, any more
Yes.
question? Okay, to see you on Tuesday.
So,
Okay, okay,
yeah.
bye bye. I have a meeting at 2 o'clock, so I've got.
Thank you, sir. Bye,
Thank
sir.
you, Moise.
Bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye. Okay, bye. I have to go, guys.
Bye, sir. Bye.